today on Ag News Daily.
Given what I know up to this point in the year, I'd say that the Corn Belt, especially the western side of the Corn Belt west of the Mississippi, has got about a 60% chance of seeing drought develop. That could take yield off the top.
Well, welcome back to the weekly edition of the Ag News Daily Show. We're not together today while we do this recording. How you doing, Delaney?
That's right, we're not. I'm doing well. I've been at the National Agri-Marketing Association conference this week. Got to give a quick shout out. Got some cool new ag swag from Jordan Van Trump and the Ag Swag crew, but down here learning about marketing, how to use artificial intelligence in your marketing, some really cool stuff.
Yeah, that's really great. I've been seeing a lot of things going around social media about using AI to make the Barbie doll version of yourself. Have you tried that yet?
No, I'm tempted to get on that bandwagon. What about you? Have you made it? Or maybe I should make one for you.
Well, we Farm for Profit did post mine first. Out of all three of us co-hosts, we ended up posting mine first. We did play around with it, but it is striking as to what these action figures could look like. So it'll be interesting to see what you learn about how AI can be used.
It certainly is.
Well, we know some planters have started rolling this week, and some areas, nothing's turning a wheel. Heavy rain has led to widespread and intense flooding across the southern Midwest. It put a pause on field work for many of those farmers. With saturated soils and local rivers still at flood stage, it will take some time before conditions there improve. While the small disturbance will bring spotty showers over the next couple of days, most areas will receive little to no additional rainfall. However, some already soaked regions could see streaks of more moderate rain, which will slow that recovery even more. The overall forecast calls for below normal precipitation through next week. That should help some areas dry out, especially with a couple of weather systems expected to pass through that may not bring much precipitation to the ground. Temperatures, on the other hand, will continue to swing back and forth. That variability may cause some delays in planting progress until temperatures become warmer and become more stable. Meanwhile, much of the central and southern plains picked up that beneficial rain from a slow-moving system last week. Through western Kansas, a large part missed out. Cold air following that system brought frost and freeze conditions into the early part of the week. This week, dry weather, warming temperatures could favor more field work here in the Midwest, especially Iowa, but not necessarily positive for wheat acre development. Isolated showers are possible into the weekend, but those most recent heavy rains will continue to cause problems not only for producers, but also, Delaney, for barge traffic. Moving ag products along the Ohio River and its tributaries will be a challenge.
Certainly will. We're going to talk a little bit more about that because AccuWeather has reported a staggering estimate of $80 to $90 billion in total damage and economic loss after we've seen quite a bit of flooding and a rare atmospheric river funneled extreme rainfall across parts of the central U.S. This powerful system collided with a multi-day outbreak of severe weather and tornadoes, all fueled by a series of slow-moving storms. From April 2nd to April 6th, thunderstorms repeatedly hit the same areas with anywhere from 8 to 16 inches of rain. Some communities even saw up to 20 inches of rain, Tanner. Those states hit the hardest included Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana, where widespread flash flooding turned deadly and destructive. The intense floodwaters damaged or washed away roads and railroad tracks throughout those regions. This impact is expected to have long-term effects on commerce and shipping logistics, as you were just talking about, especially in areas where vital infrastructure has now been compromised by those fast-rising waters. Specifically, the heavy rain across the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys is pushing the Mississippi River higher. While the rain has ended and some rivers have crested, the National Weather Service says the Mississippi River will keep rising as runoff flows downstream. The Ohio River crested at about 36.63 feet in downtown Louisville on Wednesday, the highest since 1997 flood, and the 8th highest on record there. Further downstream, the river at the Cannleton Lock and Dams reached major flood stage Wednesday and is expected to rise at least another foot before hopefully cresting today on Friday. In Mississippi, the National Water Prediction Service says the Mississippi River and some tributaries could hit flood stages in the coming days. And at Vicksburg, the river is forecasted to crest at about 48 feet around April 19th, 5 feet above the flood stage. Experts says this kind of atmospheric river is extremely rare for this region, and the combination of heavy rains, repeated storms, and tornadic activity made the event especially destructive. And Tanner, I don't know about you, but I've seen some pretty scary photos and videos floating around social media, especially in the Louisville area where stuff is just completely underwater.
Yeah, it's always tough to figure out which ones are from this event, which ones are from past events, but nonetheless, the devastation looks to be immense. We did get into what feels like spring because we got this week as the mark of the release of the first crop progress report of the season that came from the USDA. This gives us that early look at planting activity across the country. As of April 6th, 2% of this year's corn crop has been planted in the top 18 corn growing states, right on track with the 5-year average. So far, corn planting is underway in 6 states. Nearly 60% is planted in Texas, which leads the way. Missouri and North Carolina at 6%, Kansas at 4%, Tennessee at 3%, and Kentucky is just 1% planted. At this time last year, 7 states had been planting corn. Over in the top 9 oat growing states, 31% of oats planting is complete. That's slightly ahead of the 5-year average at 28%. And for winter wheat, USDA reports 5% of the crop has headed in 5 of the top producing states, right in line again with the average there. These early season numbers are a key benchmark, so we will continue to watch the planting progress and see how this weather impacts the weeks ahead. It's surprising there. I feel like, Delaney, in our area around Iowa, we had a lot of soybeans going in the ground, so we'll see if Iowa pops up on that next crop progress report for soybean planting.
I was going to say, I think at our family farm, or my husband's family farm, oats were going in the ground this week, so we're part of that 31% there that is getting complete. But yeah, I would expect to see probably planters all roll in here within the next week or two. I don't know, Tanner, if you guys have a date earmarked yet, but I think for us sometime mid next week.
Yeah, we've got beans in the ground as we've recorded this, and getting that corn planter up and ready, dragging our feet a little bit, hope for these soil temperatures to get a little bit warmer.
Well, as we switch news here into some larger economic and trade policy news, as of recording this Friday morning, President Trump has announced a 90-day pause on tariffs for more than 75 countries that did not retaliate against earlier U.S. trade measures. China, which hit back with steep tariffs of its own, will now face even higher U.S. duties, bringing total tariffs on Chinese goods to 125%. In response, China says its 84% tariffs on U.S. imports took effect Thursday. What would that have been? April 10th at 12:01 a.m. U.S. time. However, shipments that left the U.S. before April 10th and arrive in China before May 13th will be exempt from those new tariffs. The White House also released a list of agriculture-related exemptions to the new 10% duties and reciprocal tariffs. Excluded in those items include potash, some herbicides, pesticides, peat, lumber, lubricating oils, and certain veterinarian pharmaceuticals like tranquilizers and vaccines. So some positivity there for producers who hopefully won't be impacted by higher prices, but these exemptions do not apply to the 25% tariffs already in place on Mexico and Canada, even though Canadian supplies many of these affected goods. So Tanner, it'd be interesting to see if we get any fresh trade and tariff news here over the weekend.
Well,
but I know Secretary Rollins was also talking about this recently.
Yeah, I was just going to share that. Ag Secretary Brooke Rollins said the U.S. could reach new trade deals as soon as the end of this week. This comes as President Trump imposes those baseline tariffs that you just described on all imports, even higher duties with some of America's largest agricultural trading partners. According to Reuters, 70 countries have already reached out to the U.S. to begin tariff talks. To put a break in the story, Delaney, can you imagine, at least I imagine, that red hotline phone on the president's desk and it just ringing off of the hook with these discussions? But back into the story after that anecdotal Oof, that's a tough word as well. Comment of mine. In the White House and Congress, they're now discussing the potential tariff relief package as it builds pressure from ag groups warning of serious economic fallout. Rollins told Fortune, "We're setting up the infrastructure to support our farmers and ranchers in these short-term impacts." She also told CNN the administration is preparing for a long-term damage plan, working with lawmakers to line up that financial support. During the first President Trump-era trade war, U.S. farmers were hit hard, prompting the USDA to issue $23 billion in aid. While the Secretary of Ag Rollins didn't give a figure this time, she emphasized that they will be ready if help is needed.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of rumors and confirmation, Tanner, that there is very likely going to be another round of some sort of market facilitation payment program, if you will, like we saw under the first President Trump administration. So we'll see when and if those shake out. But President Trump administration is also considering a different plan for fees on Chinese ships visiting U.S. ports. The Economic Times says significant pushback against the plan came from industries that all said the idea would bring economic devastation. The changes now being considered include delaying the plan of implementation and a new fee structure that would lower the cost for Chinese ships to visit U.S. ports. This subject came up during the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer's testimony at the U.S. Senate Finance Committee hearing earlier this week, where he told lawmakers that not all of the proposed multi-million-dollar fees for Chinese ships to dock at U.S. ports would be implemented and might not be cumulative. The USTR office has suggested fees could top $3 million per port call in the U.S. for those Chinese-built ships. The administration says this fee would halt China's growing maritime influence and help promote more of America's domestic maritime industry.
That's right. Well, Delaney, I've got more Secretary Rollins news. Of course, she came to see us here in Iowa. Well, I guess not you and me, but at least farmers in Iowa. And during that visit last week, she said passing a new 5-year farm bill is a top priority, but mentioned it isn't going to be easy to get done. Rollins noted the farm bill has failed twice now since its original plan year to be done was written in 2023, and emphasized on Monday while in the state it is crucial for farmers and ranchers, so passing it will require bipartisan support in the Senate. Only 15 to 18% of the bill covers direct farm programs, but 60 votes are needed to move it forward, meaning 10 to 13 Democrats will need to join Republicans on passing this. Rollins said there is a lot of conversations and negotiations that have already been happening. Meanwhile, Senator Joni Ernst warned that the cost of the farm bill keeps rising. The last bill costs over $800 billion, but current estimates put the new one at $1.5 trillion, which is almost double. Delaney?
And that current farm bill expires again in September. That's where the latest kind of extension will end. So they do have a little time, Tanner, but as we know, Congress does not like to move too fast on these things.
That's correct.
Well, Bayer, through its subsidiary Monsanto, is asking once again the U.S. Supreme Court to weigh in on Roundup litigation, this time in the Durnell case, as said in a press release earlier this week by the company. The company filed a petition for a writ of certiorari just 3 business days after the Missouri Supreme Court opened the door for a possible high court review. At the heart of this case in particular is a legal dispute over whether federal law overrides state-based failure to warn claims, a central issue in tens of thousands of Roundup lawsuits currently pending in courts across the country. Bayer argues that a split among federal appeals courts on this issue makes it ripe for Supreme Court review. The company says the outcome could have major implications for its ability to continue supplying glyphosate-based products to farmers and other users. The Supreme Court declined to hear a similar case back in 2022, but Bayer hopes the recent appellate court split increases the chance of the High Court stepping in this time. A win for Bayer could dramatically limit or potentially end much of the ongoing litigation, but it remains unclear, Tanner, just how far-reaching that impact would be.
That's right. Well, we also saw a bipartisan group of U.S. senators begin urging the EPA to boost its biofuel blending targets in line with current production levels. In a letter sent Tuesday to the EPA administrators Lee Zeldin, Senators Chuck Grassley of Iowa and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota led the call to raise the renewable fuel standard, RFS, volumes for biomass-based diesel and advanced biofuels. The senators warned that setting targets too low may hurt rural communities, and it has in the past. They've also encouraged the EPA to adopt multi-year blending standards to give the industry a more stable base to grow from. The letter signed by lawmakers from 10 different states, highlighting how biofuels are expanding into maritime, rail, and aviation markets, and how they often cost consumers less than traditional fuels.
Well, Tanner, as we wrap up some of our news, here's a fun story for our listeners. Midwest Dairy, a checkoff organization that represents dairy farmers and families across a 10-state region, says its effort to grow the dairy industry is paying off. In its 2024 annual report, the group says 13.5 million incremental pounds of milk were sold thanks to a strategic partnership and marketing efforts across their 10-state region. With nearly 93% of Americans using social media monthly, Midwest Dairy ramped up their influencer campaigns on TikTok and Instagram to connect with Gen Z and adult consumers. One big focus was pizza, a top 5 menu item in the U.S. that drives major cheese demand. Pizza restaurants are actually the largest users of cheese. I didn't know that, Tanner, making them a key target for boosting dairy sales. The report also highlights a new grant writing support program launched with the platform Lasso to help farmers secure funding for on-farm projects. One success story is Compass Rose Creamery in Minnesota. From the grant funding, they expanded into cheese making, reducing some of their financial risk and adding value to the dairy business. But I'd gladly eat pizza to help support the dairy industry.
I do love me some pizza, but listeners, we've got a challenge now for a guest of ours. There's no better time than now to give an actual weather forecast, better than what I do at the beginning of these shows. So let's hear from weather expert Eric Snodgrass and his predictions that he made a couple of weeks ago. So we'll see how those have come to fruition here with this interview that came from Commodity Classics. So here's that conversation right now.
All right, well, we're catching up with Eric Snodgrass, Science Fellow with Nutrien Ag Solutions here at Commodity Classic. We're recording this conversation a few weeks before it's airing, but I think the big question, now that we've gotten through some of the short-term weather, is what's ahead for the growing season as planters start to roll here very soon, Eric?
Well, good news is we've warmed up. It's no longer, brutally cold Arctic air, so I like that. Plus, that gets rid of some of the dry air. But we need to see the rest of March and April actually stay relatively active. And I think there's just too much of fall's drought lingering, kind of beneath our topsoil that if not corrected through a pretty active early spring, we're going to find ourselves just, without a full profile. And therefore, we won't be able to buy adequate time during our growing season, which means I just think that the start of this growing season is going to be heavily reliant on just-in-time rains. And that may be the case all the way through unless we get a pretty big pattern correction to just get us going. But, I've said this for 15 years, spring can undo all of winter's sins. And so as we kind of sit here just on the edge of when it could really start to turn, I'm hoping that it turns for the better, just to kind of return some moisture because we need it.
Yeah, as we think about this 24-25 winter season, where we're at in central Iowa, we didn't see a lot of heavy snowfall. I think that was maybe the story across other parts of the Midwest for sure. As you look at kind of that Corn Belt broader geography, though, what is soil moisture and what did snowfall look like as we head into this growing season?
Yeah, so most of the upper Midwest, Western Corn Belt, Northern Plains had a 15 to 20 plus inch deficit on snow this year. All the snow was down in New Orleans, right? I mean, it was down south, and that just tells you we had too much Arctic air over us. And Arctic air is the driest air on the face of the earth. And as a result, we got cold, but didn't have the benefit of the snow. And any snow that did fall tend to have very high ratios, which means there was a lot of snow depth with very little liquid in it. Okay, but the soil moisture really ultimately tells you what you're going to get as you go into the season. And honestly, you just look at a map of it from the Dakotas of Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, parts of Missouri, northern half of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That's a huge chunk, some of the most productive ground in the world, that is still in deficit. So I go down to about 3 feet looking at some NASA-derived soil moisture, and they're in like the 2 to 10 percentile. I want to see them in the 30 to 70. That would be ideal. Wow. And so unless we can get really good spring rains early before we have to get in and get in the field in earnest, we got some issues here. So that's the problem. If spring is going to correct fall's problem, fall's drought, it's going to be its own, bag of trouble, right? Because we're going to look at super tight windows during that time frame. So, yeah, asking about soil moisture is probably the most important thing.
So a little bit of a double-edged sword, because we could use the moisture, but if we get that moisture during the spring planting season, that's going to really limit the window we're able to get planted.
And I think it's worse the farther east you go. So if I'm in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, just 3-4 weeks ago, Kentucky had 8 to 12 inches of rain across it. They're looking at tight windows, just too much moisture. I'm curious as to how far you go to the west of the Mississippi, the problems just continue to be with a lack of good moisture.
Okay, so let's move beyond the planting season. Maybe let's run some hypotheses or some different scenarios. If we do get that rain during spring planting, we get the crop in the ground, what are the weather patterns telling you about what this growing season is going to be? And I'm curious to know too, El Nino, La Nina, what are we in? And if we don't get that rain, what does that mean for the growing season?
Well, if we don't get it, that means we'll just be waiting for just-in-time rains. And some years, that carries the crop. It really does. You get just the perfect amount in July, and on your corn, it seems to do okay. And July and August and beans, but that puts a lot of stress, right? You're like, okay, I'm now relying on the atmosphere to deliver when it hasn't. So you come back to some bigger picture things. Let's do some scenario analysis on this. Let's go with the scenario where I'm wrong first, because I'm concerned about drought coming in from the west. We've got 70% of the lower 48 in some form of drought. That includes abnormally dry. I just told you about the big pocket of the Midwest, which has terrible subsurface soil moisture. There's been dryness in the Canadian prairie. There's massive drought down in the southwest. And you're just going, okay, all of that's around us. It's to our west, and it will migrate. So if I'm wrong and it doesn't get here, I'm worried about tight spring windows. But overall, I think we could get into a pattern where the west is baking. Now you're saying, give me a good year. That would be like 2021. The west took on all the heat. Parts of the Midwest saw good moisture and good temperatures. But shoot, middle of June 2021, Portland, Oregon hit 118. I'm talking like crazy heat out there. If that's the case, we're not going to be talking about drought or yield problems at all here. But if you flip that script and you say fall's drought isn't corrected with spring rains, you say the atmosphere loses its momentum coming across the Pacific by June, and I start to see cold water upwelling in the Gulf of Alaska, I don't care what La Nina is doing. At this point, my focus is on the Gulf of Alaska, and if it starts getting colder and colder in June, there's only one time in the last 50 years where we have had cold water in the Gulf of Alaska in June and July and still had above trend yields, and that was last year. That's very, very rare. 72 was a close year to that. But if instead the flow stays up and the waters there are warm, 1983 is the only year where we've had below trend yield with above trend temperatures in the Gulf of Alaska. So to be honest with you, La Nina is fading fast, and I don't care. I'd rather be paying attention to the west coast of North America for the ocean temperature pattern to kind of give us a clue maybe what summer's going to hold. And if you want to put a number on it right now, given what I know up to this point in the year, I'd say that the Corn Belt, especially the western side of the Corn Belt west of the Mississippi, has got about a 60% chance of seeing drought develop. That could take yield off the top.
You read my mind, because that's where I was going next, is if you were a betting man, what would you put on that?
I'm one coin flip over 50-50, and here we are in March talking about it, but I think it's worth noting.
Yeah. The other thing I think worth noting is definitely river levels as we're looking across. How are we going to get product to where growers need it as we're getting ready for maybe some spring field work, getting into the field? What's your outlook there?
Yeah. So something to remember here, the Mississippi Basin, right, drains 40% of the land area of the lower 48, and it is the largest system of flat navigable water space on Earth. Like no other river. In fact, you add them all up, they don't match the Mississippi Basin in terms of being able to put a barge on water and move it across a river. Okay. The Ohio's flooded. The Mississippi River at Memphis came up 35 feet in 3 weeks.
Wow.
You just drive a short ways up to St. Louis. I just checked this morning. It was 2 feet below low stage. So that tells you that the Missouri Basin, which starts in Montana, comes all the way through to St. Louis, and the upper Mississippi, they don't have the water percolating through the soil, getting into that river system, and it's evident at St. Louis. I just drove over it a week ago, and I'll tell you, you look out there and you see a lot of shoreline on the side. But then you go any farther south and it's all flooded. It's just a complete mess on the Ohio River side of things. So it's one of these stories of not just like the haves and the have-nots, it's like the have-nothings and the have way too muches, and those two groups are competing. And unfortunately, I'm not so sure spring is going to undo those, that kind of dipole in the pattern.
So there's not necessarily a lot of moisture in the north.
No.
That's going to cause flooding like we saw maybe back in 2019.
No.
It's all further south.
Yes. 2019, we had 12 inches of liquid in the snowpack in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The Red River of the North flooded. We had tons of moisture that came down that river. The Missouri, if you remember, through parts of like Nebraska, just blew out. It destroyed land. There's none of that. It's just not there. And the warm-up we had at the end of February to start March took even the snow line clear into the Canadian prairie. So we'd already melted a lot of it, which means, I hate to say this, but if you want me to give you the most ideal forecasts, I would like to have a massive April 4th blizzard.
Oh.
Just something rips across Iowa, rips across Minnesota, Wisconsin. On the backside, we dump snow all throughout the Dakotas, and I don't want it to be gone. But April 4th blizzards, you get to keep the water. We call them blue blizzards. When they melt, that soaks in. It's slower than when the rain just runs off. And it could be just a massive, you're going to hate it when it happens, but you'll love it come May. And that's what I want.
Are there any indications that an April 4th blizzard is going to happen?
If one could happen, this would be the year that I think we could make it occur, just given the way we've seen the things shake down here at the beginning of March. I think there is the potential to have an active early spring. And I'll just say this. Thinking about spring, one of the most telling signs of where the most activity could be in spring is where the storm chasers go. And they're all planning their trips for Dixie Alley, for the Ohio Valley, for the Southeast, not for Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. So that means getting one of these big storm systems at the northern eastern Corn Belt, likely. I'm not sure how far back to the west we can get it.
What about when we're talking spring weather? I think back to last year, watching your newsletter, you were just reporting weekly all of this tornadic activity that we were having. Is this year setting itself up for that same type of formula?
It is, just different. It's all in the southeast. One of the top analogs a lot of my colleagues are using is 2011. And if you say 2011 to anybody that lives, so you just think the Ohio River's here and the Mississippi there, and you just go all the way to Florida, that is the year that is their benchmark, like worst year ever for severe weather. So to hear some of these prominent storm chasers say, look, we're going to be setting up in Alabama or Arkansas, or we're going to be down into southern Georgia, that's a red flag. That tells me that instead of the plains being, your active tornado alley, which it was last year, it's going to be southeast. And if that's the case, we have too much dry air in the plains to be worrying about.
Let's flip our attention and talk South American weather. They're coming online now with fresh soybean harvests. They're getting ready to, they're starting probably to plant now, aren't they, in some parts of Brazil and Argentina? What's the outlook there for their growing season ahead?
Yeah, some of the early safrinha corn that goes in behind the soybeans was a little late, but they made a pretty good catch up. They hit about the 5-year average just in the last few weeks. The question we all have is, if you go back and reconstruct historical yields for Brazil on safrinha corn, which is about 75% of their total corn, there's these key years where they had major drops in yield. And we're like, well, what happened? And what happened is interesting because it's the same thing that's happening at the beginning of March. Now, it's a fresh crop, so you can put heat and dryness on an early crop, and it's fine. In Iowa, as long as you get your July rain, you bake it in June, it'll be fine. Okay, their equivalent of June is basically our next 3 to 4 weeks. The concern is the dryness that's in eastern Brazil now could come back in about 4 weeks, which would be either during or post-pollination or during grain fill. And I got to be honest with you, if that hits about that time, that will be when we're talking about planting a crop in the ice states. And if they're starting to see some trouble with dryness coming in at a key moment in their growing season, timed when we're putting an acreage here, I think it could be a bullish market story. It could be. It very well could be. It'll just also depend on how many acres are intended to go in the U.S. I think that'll be tricky there. But for the first time this whole winter for us, their growing season, I actually think there's a story coming out of South America that's not like, hey, massive production. It looks like we could have weather cutting into the tail end of that safrinha crop. The question will be, do markets react? And I don't know.
Yeah, well, nobody really does.
No.
As you look then at the global picture, are there any other weather markets or countries you're watching to see, Black Sea, China, India, anywhere in there you're watching to see any stories develop?
Black Sea is going to be interesting, mainly because there's some concern that they, like Kansas and Nebraska, had 2 spells during winter where they didn't have snow on the ground and it got cold. Now, I know it's hard to kill wheat, but you put minus 10, minus 12 degree Fahrenheit air on it, there could be some problems. Overall, though, I can't look at the Black Sea right now and just say, look, we're going to have trouble. There's going to be problems. There's going to be issues. But I think that the world's going to be watching them as we go forward simply because of, changes in geopolitics with some of the recent stuff that's gone on and understanding are they going to have an adequate spring? Most weather forecast models don't paint them as having major problems, so we're going to keep an eye on that. But the big wild card for me, is just keep going to the east, China. If I start calling out 2021 as a possible analog, while that's not bad for us in the Midwest, it's bad for the West. China had major flooding along the Yangtze River.
Yes, that's right.
So we're like, okay, is that going to be a factor for this year? So in about 3 weeks, I will be focusing on the Black Sea area and on China as well, just to see if there's any sort of early signal that needs to be paid attention to there. Other than that, we always keep an eye on India and Southeast Asia. Entirely different way by which India takes crop in and out, so that's a challenging one. But there's a lot of question about, given what we think soybeans will be across the planet, how much Southeast Asia into Indonesia is going to grow this year. We'll just keep an eye on those things, because if they flip off of La Nina fast, they're going to talk about dry conditions in that area. And that could be a factor to be discussed. And we all think that La Nina will be completely gone here by spring, and we'll be looking at neutral conditions through early summer.
Well, you always make weather such a great, fun topic. I love that. If we didn't get any questions answered that anyone tuning into the podcast wants answered, or just they want to connect with you, what's the best place to do that?
Yeah, a great website. It's real simple, ag-wx.com. I'm on there. You can reach out to me there, but all my forecast content goes there. All the maps. I got 180,000 maps on that page. I'm kind of a map junkie, but you can go there and see all of it, and that's a good way to connect to me.
Perfect. Eric, thanks so much for joining. Appreciate your time.
Well, we always appreciate our time with Eric. It's great to have him as a repeat guest on this podcast. We also have information from a repeat source of ours, Josh Linville from StoneX. In his update this week, he stated the U.S. fertilizer market, noting there's an import forecast for this year that's holding steady at 5.15 million tons, with about 2.55 million tons expected to be imported in March, April, and May. Linville says that this is manageable, but under regular normal conditions. He also touched on key market dynamics, including the impact of urea prices on UAN imports and how EU tariff discussions could affect U.S. exports. Historically, urea contracts didn't favor the U.S. net back values, but Linville pointed out that UAN prices are likely to follow urea trends. Additionally, reciprocal tariffs in Europe could slow U.S. exports. He also highlighted the recent surge in the New Orleans phosphate values, which may be overblown due to potential improvements in the U.S. production, and discussed how potash isn't likely to see major impacts from the current tariffs. But when we talk other markets, Delaney, what's been happening this week?
Well, the tariff pause that we saw announced earlier this week certainly gave the markets a little bit of breathing room. We did see markets, including the stock markets, react very favorably to that at first, but it seems markets have come back down off of that high. We also saw a really quiet WASDE report this week. Grains were mixed after that USDA report came out on Thursday. Corn was up about 7 to 9 cents in nearby months. New crop was up about 3. Soybeans were up about 7 to 17 cents across all contract months, and wheat was the only market here who really was dealt some maybe slightly negative news in the WASDE report, pushed the markets down about 2 to 10 cents across those 3 wheat complexes. We also saw this week pork production was cut a large 350 million pounds this month, putting it at just over 28 billion pounds. Pork exports were also cut by about 265 million pounds, taking that down to just under 7 billion pounds. And the average hog value was lowered to about $61 per hundredweight, down $1.61. Before the USDA WASDE report was released this week, we also got a fresh glimpse into what Brazil is sharing their crop looks like. The Brazilian CONAB released their supply and demand forecast, which did not come in line with what USDA said. No surprise there, but CONAB has the Brazilian soybean crop at 167.9 million metric tons. That's up about 600,000 metric tons from last week. And they also estimated for their corn crop, a larger crop as well, up 2 million metric tons from their prior estimate. They stated that improved weather and elevated plantings are behind the larger production forecast, Tanner. So certainly going to start to see a lot of attention and eyes focus now on South America as they get into a fresh growing season here as well.
Well, we know we will continue to keep you updated on headlines, especially on weather forecasts from around the world, what we're seeing with tariffs, and now we've got planting progress reports to continue to keep you updated on. So make sure you check back with us next Friday for the full show. Of course, we'll dribble some clips out during the week to make sure you've got the latest information. But Delaney, hopefully you have a safe trip back, but I think it's time to let the listeners go.
I agree. Let's let them go.